Hi, I'm Inc.'s editor-at-large, Tom Foster. I'm thrilled to be here for this session of the Purpose Power Summit. Welcome to Eye of the Beholder, conveying purpose to consumers. Joining us today are three guests I'm very excited about. We have Miriam Banakaram, Head of Marketing for Nextdoor, Brian Deffa, CMO of LifeBridge Health, and Matt McGowan, Director and General Manager at Snap. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. So let's just jump in. Miriam, let's start with you. I would love to hear all of you talk for just a moment about how brand purpose sort of comes to life in your own line of work, in your companies. Miriam, let's just start with you.
Yeah. So, I don't actually think of it as brand purpose. For me, purpose is sort of the way Jim Collins talks about it in his book, Good to Great, right? It's really about your North Star and your business strategy. It's the difference that you want to make in the world. Of course, you want to make money because you're in business, but what is the difference that you want to make in the world? And so at Nextdoor, our purpose is around cultivating kindness and enabling everyone to have a neighborhood that they can rely on. That's really the organizing principle and the strategy that drives our business. From a marketing brand perspective, we actually think about how we communicate that and what that means to our neighbors, our neighborhood ecosystem on a day-to-day basis. And so we try and translate that in a meaningful way. But I think about purpose as a much more holistic idea. And frankly, I always think of it, it's funny, when I was in college, I took a course, because I'm that old, with Edward Deming. And he always talked about this idea of having a broad lens when you thought about your business. He didn't use the word purpose at the time, but to me, those are very interlinked, because if you have a really clear North Star and you think broadly about your business, you can actually pivot when other people can, right? And he used to give this example of railroads not seeing the cars or the carriages, because they thought of themselves as a very linear business versus thinking about themselves as a business that moved body from place to place. And so I think when you have a broad definition for your business, it allows you to think about not only how you behave, but also in terms of M&A and other opportunities for innovation that allows you a much broader canvas.
That's a great point. Brian, let me swing to you next.
I want to build on something Miriam said, which is, Care Bravely is really, for us at LifeBridge Health, we're a large healthcare system in the Mid-Atlantic, but for us, we're really about caring for the community in which we do business. And we had grown through acquisition like a lot of other health systems, and we needed that North Star. We needed something which was, tied to our history, was true to who we are and what we sought to do, but really told the community and told our team members at the same time, and acted as a rally cry, what we were about, why you should come to work for us. When you show up to work, what kind of behaviors we expect of you and how we expect you to contribute to their overall narrative. And what Care Bravely did was it tied back to who we are, what we've always been since our founding in the 19th century, but really put a modern spin on it. We're not just healthcare providers. We're not just deliverers of care and treating pathologies. We're about being in our communities in ways that maybe a healthcare system wouldn't traditionally engage. So, mobile health units, taking healthcare to the people on the street, having partnerships with African-American barbers and predominantly African-American communities to really promote the awareness of knowing your numbers and getting screened and early testing. So for us, it was really about taking what we had always been, which is a healthcare provider, but thinking critically about, if we're really to be parts of our community, what does that mean? And driving healthcare into the community where it's most needed.
That's great. Matt, I'd love to ask you the same question. How does purpose manifest for you at Snap?
It's a great question, and I have to say I'm in complete agreement with both my colleagues. But and in that vein, I'd just like to add one thing, really, and it's that the consumer these days, more than ever, is looking to purchase from brands, from companies that have a purpose outside of, above and beyond generating profit. And in that vein, like for us, we Snapchat, we very much focus on the Gen Z and millennials. They represent 4.4 trillion, I believe, in global purchasing power, which is like something like 40% of global consumers. And And what we see is that the overarching, the vast majority, 82% of them in the US and Canada, believe that they have a personal responsibility to create the change they want to see in the world. And they're going to buy from companies that kind of align with that philosophy. So purpose is critical, I guess, the short answer.
I would love to, let's stick with you for just a moment and follow up on that point. I think that how that has changed over the last however many years is a really interesting question. And is it primarily about the new generation of consumers and how what their attitudes are, or are we seeing that sort of throughout the entire sort of consumer base across other generations of consumers as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I remember when I was in school, 30 years ago or so, I was taught that like the sole purpose of a company was to create a dividend or value for shareholders. And that was literally it. I think that was what the textbook said. So my guess is that's changed. And I think if anything, like if we think about the status quo, I think one thing we can all agree on with what's gone on over the last year and a half, like the status quo has changed. And if the status quo favors the incumbents, then it appears to me, I would assume that it's a really good time to pivot or to think about your business differently than maybe what we had all learned in school. So is it just Gen Z and millennials? It's a good question. We focus primarily on that audience, and I must say is definitively Gen Z and millennials that are at least, trying to drive this change, but I think it's broader than that. I really do.
Yeah. Brian, I want to ask you, Matt was just talking about how things have changed over the last 18 months or so, through the pandemic. Obviously, the line of business that you're in, you've been really directly engaging with this pandemic. How has purpose changed for LifeBridge over the last year and a half?
Yeah, Tom, it's been quite the roller coaster, I will say. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's changed in healthcare specifically. I will say that it really has stripped away a lot of the day-to-day activity in the business of healthcare and really centered a lot of us, even those of us who aren't clinicians, and really centered us around what we do every day, which is, make people healthy and really impact their lives in kind of a monumental or consequential way. So, I wouldn't say it's changed it, but I certainly would say it's gotten more attention as to, what we're doing here and the impact that we can possibly have. So it's, incumbent upon us to really find that purpose in our own lives, but really, put the pedal down on what purpose means in doing our job. It's not just people who walk in the four walls of the hospital. It's how we engage in the community to really make it a healthier place for all of us.
Miriam, one of the things that I find really fascinating about Nextdoor, have always found fascinating about Nextdoor, is how it is, this digital social network, but centered around actual physical communities. Mm-hmm. And in this past year and a half, as so many of us have spent so much more time at home in those physical neighborhoods, those physical communities, I imagine you guys saw some really interesting changes in how people interact with that world, that physical world around them. And I'm curious how that manifested for Nextdoor in terms of its purpose and sort of how consumers sought that sort of purpose. You mentioned sort of cultivating kindness, how consumers sought that purpose sort of differently over the past year and a half.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first joined Nextdoor, I remember looking at that line, to cultivate a kinder world where everyone has a neighborhood they can rely on. I was like, neighborhood they can rely on. I get that, right? Like you get on Nextdoor, you need a babysitter, you need a plumber, you've lost your dog. There's a utility case. I get that. I was like, kinder world. What does that mean? I mean, it seems so lofty. And then I think I took the job 3 weeks before COVID. And then, March happened and we saw the number of people on the platform who were offering and asking for help. You were stuck in place, and if you were immunocompromised, you couldn't go get groceries, you couldn't go get, prescriptions. And so I mean, there was an 80% increase in daily active users in that very first month. But what was remarkable wasn't so much, the uptick in the business, but the actual need that you were solving, which was connecting neighbors based on proximity. And so the team quickly pivoted and actually enabled groups so that you could find each other faster. And one of the most remarkable things was that we had a map that allowed you to pin your house for trick-or-treating purposes, right? Because you wanted to know who in your neighborhood had candy. They took that map and actually made it into a help map. And so then you could see who was offering or asking for help in a visual way and actually figure out how close or far away from them you were. So, it was really about being there meaningfully. It wasn't a gimmick, right? It was like people were dying. Like, this is serious. This is not about what's happening for my brand or my business. This is like, how can we actually be there meaningfully? And I think, I live in Chelsea in New York. I immediately set up a group called Neighbors Helping Neighbors. And then the map happened and we were able to say, oh, here's somebody on 11th and 24th that needs help. Somebody was coming all the way from the West Village. Could we find her somebody closer? So that ability to support each other, I think, is what community is all about. And if there was a silver lining of the pandemic, I would say it's that we've discovered we over me as a society. And this ability to want to help is actually, I think Adam Grant writes a lot about, and you began to see it in these last, more than a year, frankly, right? We're all in place. You get to know the people. I used to say I was one with the team at LaGuardia and O'Hare. And now I actually spend time with Nathaniel and Troy, and I get to see Joan at the coffee shop. But for months, we were just checking in on each other on Zoom calls or on Google Hangouts because, Joan and her husband, Bob, who were in their 80s and 90s, hadn't left their house for, 8 months. So that sense of like, not just caring about them or the people down the street who you occasionally come out and, clap for the essential workers, but also all the small businesses, right? Our neighborhoods are an ecosystem. They're about the EMT workers, Stefan, who owns Bergamot, Murray's Bagel Shop. It's like that whole vitality is critical. And I would say one of the interesting things is that we did research about our core and prospects. And what you noticed in the middle of the pandemic was that people literally used earth tones to describe their connection to place. So you're in a place, you actually are living someplace, you have an attachment to it. I'm very attached to the fact that I live in New York and I live in Chelsea. I'm a downtowner. It's part of my identity. And then as people dug into that, they would actually talk about plugging into the energy source of their neighborhood. They would actually talk about, the bird watch. I mean, I was noticing that there were tulips. I'd never noticed that there were tulips in Chelsea, right? So you began to actually get connected to the ground. And I think that was definitely a shift that was happening because we'd all been so mobile, right? And all of a sudden you were in place.
I think that's so fascinating. And I think in the case of Nextdoor, in particular, I imagine this past year was validating in a way of that purpose. You can sort of have that purpose and pursue that purpose, but then to have this kind of unprecedented time in which that purpose is sort of more important than ever, and the opportunities to sort of live up to it are sort of bigger than ever. Must have been really fascinating. Matt, I want to ask you a version of that. How did that same kind of engagement with purpose manifest over these past 18 months? You mentioned, that it was sort of intensified over the past 18 months, but how did that really come to life for you at Snap?
It's a great question, and similar to Miriam, we talk a lot about connecting individuals on Snapchat. So if before I jump into it, if we can agree that communication is key to any healthy relationship, and for a long time we were not really allowed to spend time with those we have relationships with outside of our nuclear family. We kind of look to the camera, and Snapchat's a camera company, and we believe that reinventing the camera represents the greatest opportunity to improve the way people communicate and live. And very much in a similar fashion, whereas we're not necessarily focused on place like Nextdoor, we look at it more relationships. And what we saw was it was interesting. Our concern was that if people weren't out and about, if Snapchatters weren't out and about, they wouldn't have anything to share. But what happened was, because they weren't out and about, they leaned in to share even more. to stay connected with those that they love, their friends, colleagues, and family and such.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Communication became more important than ever.
Right. Exactly.
Fascinating. So I would love to pivot for just a moment and let's talk about from your experience, whether we can draw some sort of best practices in talking about brand purpose. I mentioned at the outset that I always find sort of a tension between talking about a company's purpose, a brand's purpose, and making sure that language is perceived as authentic and not just sort of opportunistic. Let's stick with you, Matt. I would love to hear from your experience, sort of some best practices to share with our viewers about that.
Oh, wow. Big question. And I think there's no one right way. That said, I do believe it's about follow through. It's easy to convey purpose. It's harder to actually realize it and show it. And so for me, I think that's probably the biggest thing. It's making sure that as a company, whatever purpose you've identified as your North Star, that there's just a plan and it's operationalized and actionable to go and do that. So, consumers at the end of the day, I think there was the purpose, the brand trust index that came out recently said something like the companies are the most trusted source at the moment, above and beyond governments and media, which was interesting. And if that's the case, then it's up to us as constituents and as executives within our businesses to follow up on that and to make sure that we actually live up to those beliefs.
Brian, I'd love to ask you the same question. Can you talk a little bit about, from your experience, best practices in sort of talking about purpose in ways that are effective?
It's one of the most unleveraged strategic assets organizations have. And by that, I mean, we have to be intentional as leaders about sharing that brand purpose, sharing it internally, making sure that every team member is empowered to act upon it. So a lot of organizations, enact strategies from the top down saying, you will do this, you will do that. But if you crystallize really what your business is about and what you're there to do for people and customers, and then empower 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people to find ways in whatever their job is to live that brand purpose, that will create untold amounts of goodwill and assets for the organization, far beyond what anybody sitting in the executive suite could ever do. At Lifebridge Health, what we tried to do was crystallize that brand purpose, make sure everybody in the executive team understood it and was driving it into their plans, but then also communicate it to all of our team members, and at the same time communicate the same words to our consumers. So consumer, executive, and team member alike were all singing from the same song sheet. So there was no miscommunication or distilling of a mission statement or anything like that. It was a couple of words designed to be intentional, designed to be interpreted by whomever was reading them to our business and to the end user, or consumer's family, or a patient themselves. So I think it's incumbent upon leaders to give permission to say, you don't need us to say yes or no to your idea. You go implement the idea as long as it lives up to these 2 or 3 words. That's the power of what purpose really can deliver for an organization and ultimately for the consumer.
Miriam, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we live in an era of transparency. You don't own your brand, your consumers own your brand. In our case, neighbors own our brand. I think it's about your actions and not just your words. I mean, you have to have words. We use words to communicate, but everybody's smart enough to know that it's actions that really matter. And so if I think about moments where you're at a crossroads and you use a framework, your purpose as your framework at which to make decisions, that's really the time when people actually say these people mean business, right? And whether it's your employees or your neighbors or your consumers, whatever it is, everybody's smart enough, and these days everybody has access to information. So everybody's waiting for you to not actually mean what you say. And so actions are what matters. I think companies are purpose-driven it's about their DNA, right? And so if that's within the DNA of the organization and people believe in it, you're not trying to cascade it down. They're actually living it on a day-to-day basis. When I was at Hyatt, we talked a lot about this because we were a global company with 100,000 employees, and we were a very operationally intensive company. And when we worked on our purpose, we were sort of giving people the permission to be authentic and actually come off of the playbook to be authentic in that moment, because our purpose at Hyatt was around caring for you to be your best, and care meant empathy plus action, right? So I see you in a moment and I can act. That meant that you actually had to give people permission at all levels of the organization, the guy who's checking you in, the doorman, to actually come off the playbook that was what they had historically used to operationalize a global company, to actually be their authentic self in that moment, right? That was a pretty big leap of faith, because what had enabled success was sort of these manuals and, playbooks. So I think that's why I think purpose really matters, and people look to all levels of the organization to see examples, and examples are much louder than words, right? And so when we made a decision to pass on a franchisee because they weren't offering healthcare to employees, because we said, if we stand for care and you're not offering health insurance, I mean, that might be a great deal for us on paper, but it doesn't actually align with our purpose. That was a moment where the organization was like, these people mean business, right? And I think today consumers expect that from you. I don't think, Matt's right. I don't think it's just about, Gen Xers or whatever we call everybody these days. I think everybody understands the power of the purse. So, with transparency comes privilege, and the privilege is that you can leverage your words and your purse to actually affect change, right? And so people understand that, and they expect people to step up. And Billie Jean King says pressure is a privilege, and I'd say all corporations now live in a world of privilege. And so if you say you're purpose driven, you better be willing to back that up with actions.
The flip side of that question, of course, is being purpose-driven. You use the phrase purpose-driven, I think is a great phrase. However, being purpose-driven doesn't get you a whole lot unless you are also, a sustainable business who can, remain purpose-driven, right? And I'm curious from any one of our guests. We're running out of time here. Can you talk for just a moment about how to ensure that talking about purpose and activating purpose actually drives the business results as well? Matt, let me throw it to you, and what's your take on that?
It's another good question, and it's you can only make, when you make a decision, you kind of move down that path, and you never really know what would have happened if you went the other way. But for us, we've tied our, as I think, as Miriam said, we've tied quite a bit of our internal KPIs and metrics to various purpose that we believe in, and that our customers, the Snapchatters, the 500 million Snapchatters around the world, believe in as well. And there's no reason why you need to sacrifice growth or any of these other more kind of traditional KPIs when you focus on the environment or healthcare or whatever it might be. And what we found is that by focusing on these various purposes that are important to our community, it's only strengthened the community and brought them closer together, and made our platform more popular. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think we can definitely do this together, and see oversized growth and such.
Brian, I want to let you close it out. What's your take on that?
So in the healthcare space, it's really interesting because, by our very nature, we create lots of highly charged emotional experiences for our customers. Yet marketing and positioning in our space is still what Steve Jobs would refer to speeds and feeds. This doctor has a better CV than that doctor. We have a new proton therapy machine. They have a new proton therapy machine. It's really about that one-upsmanship, and nobody has really owned that emotive space of when you come to us, we'll pull out all the stops and do that for you. So what we saw as an opportunity, yes, we have to have the order qualifiers. We have wonderful doctors. We have great facilities, all the technology you could need. But then there's that emotional component that I don't think that is pervasive in a lot of consumer-facing industries, but it hasn't really reached healthcare. So we saw an opportunity to carve out a unique space for us and really resonate with the consumer, make sure that they understood how deeply we felt care for them and for their communities and how it's our driving force, to carve out that emotional and strategic space so we're no longer playing this commodity game of, buying that doctor or getting that machine or whatever else. We felt it was important to own that emotional space and carve out something that was defensible long term.
That's great. I want to thank all three of our panelists for being here with us today. And thanks for tuning in. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.